Good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Walsh, a Senior Media Officer with the Institute of Medicine and National Research Council. Thank you for joining us for the release of the new Institute of Medicine and National Research Council report, a framework for assessing the health, environmental, and social and economic effects of the food system. For those of you not familiar with the Institute of Medicine and National Research Council, they are operational arms of the National Academy of Sciences. They are private, independent, nonprofit institutions that provide science, technology, and health policy advice under a congressional charter granted in 1863. For each requested study, panel members are chosen for their expertise and experience and serve pro bono to carry out the study statement of task. The reports that result from the study represent the consensus view of the committee and must undergo external peer review before they are released, as did this report. I have with me several members of the committee to discuss the report's conclusions and findings, but before we introduce the committee, I want to go over a few technical aspects of the webinar. First, please note that we're recording today's event, and any questions you submit may be read aloud and included in the recording. The audio for today's event will be streamed through your computer speakers. After the opening remarks, we will take questions through the Q&A box located in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. When it is time, simply type your question in the box and click Submit. We ask that you leave the box set to send your questions to all panelists. And if you have any technical issues during the event, please contact WebEx technical support at 1-866-229-3239. Once again, the number for WebEx is 1-866-229-3239. Now I'll introduce today's participants. Joining us are several members of the committee that wrote the report. First is Malden Nessheim, Chair of the Committee and Professor Emeritus and Provost Emeritus at Cornell University. Next is Ross Hammond, a Senior Fellow and the Director of the Center on Social Dynamics and Policy at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Also is Douglas Jackson Smith, a Professor of Sociology at Utah State University in Logan. Next is Scott Swinton, a Professor in the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics at Michigan State University in East Lansing. And last but not least is Susan Krebs-Smith, the Chief of the Risk Factor Assessment Methods Branch of the Division of Cancer Prevention and Control at the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, Maryland. Also joining us is Maria Aria, Study Director for this report for the IOM, and Peggy Yee, Senior Program Officer with the National Research Council. We'll start off with Dr. Nessheim giving some opening remarks summarizing the report, and then I'll open it up to any questions you have. Please note that this briefing is scheduled to last 1 hour unless we run out of questions beforehand. And with that, I'll turn over to Dr. Nessheim.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. It's very nice to have an opportunity to discuss this report, which we're quite excited about being released today. This framework for assessing the effects of the food system. The report the study was supported by funding from the JPB Foundation to the National Academies. We're grateful for that support. The context of the food system is what is on this next slide. Agriculture and fisheries really form a bioeconomy in which part of it is the food system and part of it is a source of raw materials for other parts of our society, such as biofuels, fibers, and industrial products. But we're focusing on the food system and some of the issues associated with it. This study actually has its origins from a study 2 years ago that was supported by the Institute of Medicine and by the National Research Council and the Center for Disease Control. And it was concerned with the title of the workshop was called the True Cost of Food. And this indicated that the cost of food to society is not often, or sometimes is not always expressed in the cost of the actual price of the food. For example, issues in food production that affect quality of water are externalized and might be charged in other ways to our society rather than onto the cost of food. And this list that is on the screen now shows several of those issues that are kind of external factors that can influence the price of food, but in fact they're not always reflected in the price of food. The Board on Agriculture and the Food and Nutrition Board developed a statement of task for this committee, and we're looking now at the statement of task. This expert committee will develop a framework to assess the health, environmental, and social effects, both positive and negatives, associated with the ways in which food is grown, processed, distributed, marketed, retailed, consumed within the U.S. food system. Sounds like a pretty big task that this committee had to take on. But note it is to develop an analytical framework in which one can review the issues that we talked about in that first slide. We're supposed to examine methods and methodologies and data that we have to make comparisons and measure effects. We described in our report several examples of things in the food system or different configurations that the framework would help us understand and give us a broader perspective on. The committee was instructed to describe the strengths and weaknesses of our framework and to identify information needs and gaps in methods and methodologies. And so we do have quite a lot to say about methodologies in this report. The report, the outline of the report shown here, let me discuss it with you briefly. We describe the current U.S. food system and its evolution. The committee felt if we were going to develop a framework to examine issues of the food system, we really need to understand what the food system was and how it came about. And so we have an extensive chapter on this in the report. And then we have chapters on the health, environmental, social, and economic effects of the food system. And there we have a discussion of each of those, discuss issues in which the food system contributes to certain aspects of the environment, to our health, and the social fabric of the food system. Then the next chapter would be the framework for assessment, which I will discuss with you in some detail. And then we give examples of decisions that would benefit from use of the framework. In other words, policies and so forth that have been put in place that might have benefited if an analysis using this framework had taken place. This diagram gives our concept of the food system as a supply chain. It shows farm production and the inputs that go into farm production, and then the steps in which food goes before it reaches the consumer. And you can see it goes through a number of possible avenues, such as manufacturers, or other handlers, wholesalers, retailers. The food system is made up of a number of actors and players, and interventions anywhere in the food system can have effects that spread throughout in sometimes unanticipated ways. This slide shows some potential effects of the food system. The report recognizes that the U.S. food system has a lot going for it. The food system has been able to produce a plentiful supply of food and quite great variety for our population. Nutritional deficiencies are relatively rare, but associated with that, there are issues in the health. For example, our population is becoming increasingly obese. There are issues of pollution of water supplies from fertilization practices. There are issues associated with workers that are part of the food supply, and issues, the workers' wages, for example, in the food production area are some of the lowest in the country. So there are a number of these social and economic issues that we've identified in this table, and we discuss those in some detail in the chapters that I said that we've dealt with on the effects. Now this shows the representation of what we consider our framework. And this wheel that is in the center of this lists the principles that should guide analyses of the food system, and I want to discuss those with you with a little bit more detail. when doing analyses of aspects of the food system, we think that one needs to recognize the full effects across the food chain, across the food system. So within the food chain, it goes beyond production, but there are factors affecting processing and distribution, consumption, waste disposal. All of these things intervention in any one place can have an effect that might ripple through the food system. We think that analyses dealing with some perturbations of the food system should also consider all the domains and dimensions of effects. What is the effect on health? Does it have an environmental effect? And are there social and economic effects? And obviously there will be trade-offs as one looks at this. And we are concerned with the quality of the effect that we're dealing with. We want to know who gets it, the quantity, how is it distributed, and is it sustainable? All of those issues come up in some analysis of the food system. We also consider the food system as a dynamic system, and we have to consider that you push on the food system in one place, something might pop out somewhere else. And so we have to account for the system dynamics and complexities. And it's all not a black box, there's a lot of heterogeneity within the food system. And finally, the fourth principle is that we should choose appropriate methods for analysis and synthesis. And the report has a considerable discussion about various types of data, data sources, metrics to be used, models that are available, and methods for analysis. And this is one of the core principles that we discuss in the report. The report also shows the way in which the analysis can be carried out. One needs to talk about a problem. What is the problem that we're dealing with? What kind of problem would we like to analyze? And what is the scope of that problem? How broad are we reaching? What area of the food system are we dealing with? And how much depth are we going into this? And the scenario, if we're going to do an examination of a policy, what are we looking at? What is the change that we're looking at? What is, if the intervention is going to take place, what is the baseline from that intervention? So we need to define the scenario carefully and then do the analysis using appropriate methods and metrics. Put synthesize the results into a way that might be useful to policymakers or researchers, and let the public know what we've done in the report. This is kind of the principles of how this report, how the framework framework analysis should be carried out. Now, we have a number of examples in the report about questions that dealing with the food system that we think an analysis using this framework would be helpful. For example, the use of antibiotics in agriculture. There are issues far beyond the use of antibiotics in growth promotion, but the effects on human health and the environment are also issues that need to be taken into account. Recommendations for fish consumption and health, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. But policies mandating biofuel, blending, and gasoline supplies. Recommendations to increase fruit and vegetable consumption. Do we have, if we all ate as many of our fruits and vegetables as we're supposed to, would we have enough of them? Or how would we get them? Nitrogen dynamics and management of ecosystems. There is a dead spot in the Gulf of Mexico, probably resulting from nitrogen from agricultural field fertilization that comes down the Mississippi River and promotes growth in the Gulf of Mexico. Or last year there was issues associated with the water supply in Lake Erie, and these are all things that could be examined in this framework to take into account the broad effects of these policies. And then we have a policy on hen housing practice, which is rather specific, but you recognize that California has just this January put into effect a law in terms of housing of animals, and particularly this has been an effect on the poultry industry there. So these are issues that have a broad dimensions that could be analyzed by using this framework. The fish issue, for example, the dietary guidelines for Americans recommend 8 ounces of fish every week, which is almost double current consumption. So if in fact we all followed that dietary guideline, what would be the effects on the environment? We might empty the oceans, for example, or we would greatly increase the amount of aquaculture and the environmental issues that might be associated with that. So these examples are just meant to show you that there are issues in terms of intervention in the food system that a framework analysis of this type would be useful. The committee made a number of conclusions after spending time producing this report. We found that comprehensive analysis studies of the type that we've talked about here are somewhat rare, and that a study might look at one aspect, health aspect of an intervention, but might ignore some of the environmental and other issues. So these kind of comprehensive studies are somewhat rare in the literature. We think that integrated assessments can actually give you some new insights and ideas. If you look at this beyond the particular narrow focus, you might find out some things about the intervention that say, wow, I didn't realize that was going to happen. And that would be very useful. Interventions are likely to have systemic effects. We're talking about the food system. So if you disturb the system in one spot, something might pop out somewhere else. And we have made a major point in the report that public data sets and models are very critical to assessment, so that the data collected by many government agencies that are made public are really very important for understanding the food system and researchers and policymakers who are trying to make decisions about it. People who are affected are important, so we think that stakeholders should be consulted. We think that the challenges of the future, given the issues of climate change and other factors affecting our food system, these integrated assessments are going to be important to meet the future challenges. And we have to recognize that the context of who is driving the system and how the whole system functions is an issue that one has to consider. So we think this framework that we've developed can be used for decision makers to examine policies. We think it's important for researchers, both in both government and the private sector. We think that it will be very, very helpful to develop evidence that will understand the costs and benefits of alternative policies or considerations in the food system, and that we think the framework will be very helpful for that. We recognize that doing broad analysis, looking at all these domains, is probably, it might possibly be quite expensive, and so that we do recognize that some more limited analysis can be made, but within that, those limited analysis, people need to recognize what are the boundaries of their analysis and what is left out of the boundaries of that analysis, and what are issues that are not dealt with that might affect the social or the economic, health, or environmental things that this that the policy might develop, even though you don't do the complete framework analysis. We think the framework can be applied to any food system. It can be used in a global sense. We've concentrated on the U.S. food system, even though we recognize that the U.S. food system sits within a global network, a global food network, and that there can be assessments that can be done that apply globally. And of course, this is not a cookie cutter thing that comes out with an answer that is an automatic decision. Value judgments and other things have to be made. We have recommended strongly that data collection and various metrics and methodologies be continued. We have an appendix in the report that lists large numbers of various databases affecting the various domains we've talked about. We have lists of methodologies and models that can be used in analytical procedures, but we think it's very important that these data collection be increased and certainly sustained at least. And we also are concerned about having increased human capacity to deal with complex systems. There's a new literature and methodology that's available as to how you do analyses of complex systems, and we think that people in the academia and private sector and government need to be well versed in these methodologies to be able to undertake policy analysis in the future. So our committee was a broad committee. It had people from many different parts of the world, with many different, or of the United States, with many different kinds of expertise, and it was a hardworking committee, and I'm very grateful for their input into this report. And we had a very dedicated staff at the Institute of Medicine and the National Research Council that helped us carry out this report. So that the report can be accessed by by your computer systems in various ways, or you can contact the National Academy through these email addresses that are here. So with that, I'm going to put the picture of the framework up in front of you, and I'm going to say this is my summary of the report, and I would like to invite questions that we'll try to answer for you, my colleagues here that are here with me. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, if you would like to ask a question, you can type in your question in the lower right-hand corner box on the screen. And please, if you can type in your name and your organization in the box before asking a question, I can identify you when you ask the question. And also, we received a couple questions asking if these slides are going to be available. And if you go to www.iom.edu/food system, they will be available in time. So the first question I have, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce anybody's names, is from Yin Wang. And they say, I saw your example questions for more fish and more veggies and fruit consumption. Do you have results already showing to increase just the fish and veggies? And what about the dairy?
This was not a report that was supposed to look at all aspects of the food system in those examples. We chose examples, and the 6 examples we chose were examples that we thought would the framework would apply to if we were to analyze them in depth. There are many other questions that we could also apply to, and dairy certainly could be one of them, but we haven't done that.
Also, this report was not intended to be to provide an assessment per se, but just to show through these examples how the conceptual framework could be applied. So there aren't any assessments per se in this report. Yeah.
And that was Dr. Susan Krebs-Smith. Our next question is from Julio Quintana. They ask, to what extent does this framework integrate life cycle assessment as part of the assessment process?
Scott, would you like to answer that one?
Sure. Life cycle assessment is a good example of one of the kinds of dynamic dimensions that we advocate being included. So among the different kinds of methodologies listed in our appendix, there are several links to sources on life cycle analysis. But this is that's a great example of a methodology that goes across the different stages of the food value chain and allows us to think holistically about particular products.
Our next question comes from William Fisher at the Institute of Food Technologists. He asks, is there any one call to action that stands out or any one key takeaway from this report?
Well, I think there are 2 things that I think one takes away from this report. One is our call for this broad look across the food system. for the health, environmental, social, and economic effects of any policies or interventions. That's one of the things that the report tries to call for. And the second one is to make sure that we have access to publicly available data that we can carry out these analyses. I think those are two strong points that the report makes.
Okay. Our next question comes from Leah Miniger at the Propel Center for Population Health Impact at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. She asks, considering different levels of governments have different policy levers, would you suggest a municipal or state level or national assessment?
Scott, we're going to take that one.
We don't suggest a particular geographic or political level of assessment. They can be valuable at many levels, and one of the points that we make in the report is that systems interact with one another. So there may be a municipal food system, but that's linked to regional, national, and global food systems, just as in environmental, social, health, and economic aspects. So when you look at a particular subsystem, it's important to be cognizant of the linkages outside the system, and that's part of this idea of thinking explicitly about boundaries, being aware of them and recognizing them. So a focus may be within a particular boundary, like a municipal or state system, but there needs to be acknowledgement and understanding of how permeable those boundaries are and what assumptions you make when you say we're only looking inside certain boundaries.
Okay. Our next question comes from Gary Thornton. He asked if you could discuss the antibiotics example a bit and if you reached any conclusions.
Russ, would you like to take that one?
Sure. Yes, the antibiotic example tries to summarize the current state of knowledge on antibiotic resistance and its many sources and pathways, and then tries to walk through what it would mean to apply the framework that we develop in this report to that topic. And among the things that it concludes are both the sort of paucity of data available in the current environment and the inherent difficulty of tracing outcomes like antibiotic resistance to particular sources given the available data, and the importance of some of the methodologies that we discuss in the appendices, including modeling in particular, for this topic space in helping to inform policy decisions. Those are some of the key takeaways. That example is discussed in some detail in the framework chapter itself as the first application of the framework. So I encourage you to look at that in more detail.
This is Doug. Can I weigh in quickly?
Yes, Doug.
So Doug Jackson-Smith at Utah State University, and I think one of the points that antibiotic example or the vegetable example highlight is that the question is often originally posed with a relatively narrow scope of effects in mind. We're interested in the antibiotic issues from a perspective of human health, perhaps animal health, but the interventions that might be involved in addressing or the trade-offs and implications of changing the use of antibiotics within the food system have implications that go well beyond the human or animal health arena. And the question that the framework asks people to pose is, what would those implications be, and how would you go about thinking about integrating that additional information into an assessment about the pros and cons of various alternative approaches to antibiotics? Every approach using this framework is going to have its own framing of a problem that they're fundamentally interested in, and I think what one take-home message I would take from this exercise is that all of those more focused formulations have broader implications, and we're hoping to provide some guidance and some tools in this report to show people how to go about grappling with that.
Thank you, Doug. Our next question comes from Ellen Gray from the Washington Sustainable Food and Farming Network. She asks, does the report contain a listing or collection of current efforts trying to comprehensively evaluate food systems at either local, state, or national level?
Actually, I think the answer to that is no. We don't review those issues in the report. That's not been part of our charge.
Our next question comes from Nicole Trechner from Tufts University. She asks, I noticed one of the dimensions mentioned in the report was resilience, which seems to be studied less in other dimensions. Do you find robust methods that assess resilience within the food system?
Scott?
There are a set of modeling techniques that can be used to assess resilience. So examples of those methods, there are biophysical simulation models that are used for, I'm most familiar with the ones in the agricultural sector that look at the effects over time of different kinds of agricultural production systems under where weather data can be provided over long periods of time and projections can be made for how the system evolves over time and its effects on different environmental outcomes like greenhouse gas emissions, nitrate leaching, phosphorus runoff, soil erosion. There's another category of resilience studies that have to do with economic markets and how they relate to one another. So if there's a particular change in policy that shifts the supply or demand for some element in the food, some particular food product, there are repercussions through markets that cause prices to adjust and change, which then may have impacts on incomes and consumption levels. So those are just two examples of a set of modeling tools that are alluded to in our appendices that help to get at these questions of resilience.
Thank you. Our next question comes from David Wallinga. He asks, does the notion of being able to trace particular outcomes to particular individual factors in the food system, which was previously discussed, does this run counter to the understanding that the outcomes of systems being multidimensional and not being able to be segregated?
Ross, you want to take that one?
Sure. I think a core theme of this report is how interconnected many of the different aspects of the food system are, and how much interaction there is that drives outcomes that we care about. That said, I think from a policy perspective, in the particular case that we were discussing earlier, the antibiotic resistance case, there is a burning policy question which has to do with how much of antibiotic resistance that we are currently experiencing can be traced to the use of antibiotics in agriculture versus the use of antibiotics in human medicine. And to try to untangle that from a policy perspective is an important goal for which one might apply this framework, and does require some attempt to draw out causality through this complex system that is the food system. And we do, in fact, lay out some ways you might go about doing that, and we advocate techniques that can capture some of the richness of the food system while yielding clear insights to specific questions, and we discuss those in more detail in the report.
This overlaps a little bit with what you just said, but this question is from Eric Olson, who's a food and ag lawyer and a former USDA chief of staff. He asked, did the committee consider the relative alignment of our current policymaking and research functions and the kind of systematic analysis that the framework calls for, and do current systems impede this approach?
Doug, you want to take that one on?
I think short answer is no. The long answer is that we spend a fair amount of time in this report outlining how important the policy, political, market, institutional context is in driving the kinds of dynamics of the system that lead to effects you might study. And we talk about how an understanding of interventions or alternatives has to grapple with the fact that that might shift those policy and institutional contexts, but also you have to expect there'll be responses from those contexts. And so we discuss the importance of that arena and the fact that there are incentives in the current system that are certainly part and parcel of why the system behaves the way it does, but that looking at alternatives and looking down the road, one would have to capture that. The other part of your question, though, is if we're talk much about what prevents this type of approach from being used more widely. We did not engage that systemically in the report.
Our next question comes from Noel Estwick. He asks, He's with Prairie View A&M University. He asked, regarding advocating greater consumption of fish, how do you reconcile that with issues of contamination and other environmental issues in the Gulf?
Well, we are actually not advocating greater consumption of fish. Our example here is to use the dietary guideline, which suggests that we consume so much fish per day, as an example of a recommendation that might have ramifications beyond just the health issues that it was proposed for. And so certainly any analyses would have to take into effect contamination issues and so forth. Actually, the Academy several years ago did a report on the on the benefits and risks of consuming fish. And if you look into some Academy reports some time ago, actually I chaired that committee too, you will find something that this committee said about it.
Our next question comes from Julio Quintana from Kraft Foods. Is there some support or guidance to help an organization or group to look to implement or try this framework?
Ross, you want to try to?
Well, the report itself, of course, does not provide financial support for any particular effort to implement the framework. But what we do try to do quite carefully and systematically in the report is to give you pointers to a lot of resources that would aid you were you to try to undertake an assessment like this, both in terms of data sets that we identify, of key metrics, of methodologies, which we describe in some detail and which we provide extensive citations to help you track down further, and in terms of thinking through potential pitfalls and ways to overcome them throughout the steps of the process, which is how the framework chapter is organized.
Our next question comes from Michael Jacobson. He asked, can you give some specific findings for one of your examples, such as eating more fruits and vegetables, and what might be some of the potential negative effects?
So you want to take that one on?
Well, again, this report was not designed to do an assessment of any one of these, a full assessment with any one of these examples, but to show how the framework could be applied to the study of any one of those examples. In the example with fruits and vegetables, the question that was explored was the disconnect between the recommendation to consume more fruits and vegetables and the amount of fruits and vegetables that people eat, and all the way along the food supply chain, an apparent disconnect between the amounts that are available and the amounts that are recommended to be consumed. So in applying this framework to studying that question all along that food supply chain, it's recommended that there be consideration given beyond the health effects, which would be, definitely to ramp up production and availability of fruits and vegetables, to the socioeconomic and environmental effects as well. Now, generally, the environmental effects of a more plant-based diet tend to be beneficial. There are some social effects that would need to be considered as well that come into the production of vastly greater amounts of fruits and vegetables, including the effect on migrant, the needs of more migrant workers, and labor shortages and immigration policy and things of that sort, costs of food because they tend to be more expensive and so on.
Our next question comes from Ellen Gray from the Washington Sustainable Food and Farming Network. She asks, will the committee continue to work together, and if so, what are the next steps for assessing food systems comprehensively?
Well, unfortunately, as much as we've enjoyed working with each other, this is the release of this report actually disbands the committee. But there are several members of the committee, of course, are interested in these issues, and we're very hopeful that as we disseminate this report and people see it, that they will make use of it in examining the kind of questions that you're concerned with. Our
next question comes from Matthew Lang. He asks, first, he quotes something from Appendix B. Says there is clearly a need to produce an IT framework to integrate heterogeneous data streams from each of these knowledge domains. And can the committee describe efforts being put forth to design and create reusable information infrastructures?
We're not in a position to describe reusable information structures, but we in fact just came from a briefing with another branch, with members at another branch of the federal government who talked about the Open Data Initiative that's a priority of the current administration. So it's clear that while that wasn't within our purview to look at, it's a very important challenge and one that is being attacked both within government and perhaps in other arenas as well.
Our next question comes from Gary Thornton. He asks, is the panel optimistic that the proposed framework would be adopted? The debate on so many food issues is so entangled with political and social views.
I'm actually optimistic. We've briefed 2 or 3 agencies in the last couple of days, and there's a great deal of interest in the concepts that are in the report, the idea that one needs to look beyond individual effects or individual domains. So our intention is to make this report as widely available as possible, and that we hope that it will stimulate the kind of studies that we're advocating in this report.
Our next question is from Jesse Zulicki from ILSI North America. Does this report address any challenges in identifying and building collaborations among the different researchers in the variety of individual fields that assess specific aspects of the food system?
Doug, you want to take that one on?
Well, again, I think the time frame and the focus of what our mission was didn't point us in the direction of working out the logistics of how to overcome agency culture, how to overcome academic incentive systems that discourage some of the kinds of integrated work that we're proposing. There's a raft of reports we point to that have already been developed and studies and suggestions people have for how to facilitate that kind of research culture. And we're certainly very highly aware of that. Many of us have been involved in some of those efforts. This report doesn't go into great detail on that, though.
Our next question comes from Rebecca Klein, a food systems consultant. She asks, does the committee feel such assessments will be necessary to drive changes in the food system that would be more supportive of human and environmental health? Or do we have the info we need to make such changes?
Sue?
I don't know that we covered this in the report, but I think that to a person, everybody on the committee would believe that such assessments would be necessary in order to make some of those kinds of decisions. It seems that as we're, heading forth into the, into the 21st century with more people to feed and greater issues around food security and, kind of these 2 issues of food security and obesity for populations around the world, it seems like these issues of how we're going to supply these vast amounts of food and the effects that they could have throughout our economy, the society, and in the environment as well will be very important to be considering.
Our next question comes from Kelly Horton. She asks, as you were putting together the report, what information did you find missing or lacking in the literature that would have been helpful? In other words, what types of research do we need a further investment in?
Ross, you want to tackle that one?
Sure. Well, I think part of the impetus for the report in the first place, and certainly one of the conclusions of the report that the committee produced, is that comprehensive analyses and holistic analyses that capture all of the themes that are expressed in the framework are very rare currently, and that I think the view of the committee is that we need more such analyses because that is a major gap in the current literature. I think we also identify a number of promising specific methodologies and metrics, and one of the conclusions that Mal covered in his presentation was that greater human capital within federal decision-making agencies and universities in these approaches may be a very important part of future progress.
Our next question comes from T. Gagnon. Who do you imagine using this framework? Would this be a collaborative process between groups, organizations, and agencies, or can this assessment tool be used by one organization?
Scott?
The framework can be used in more than one way. It certainly draws upon knowledge from different disciplines. So if one organization was able to bring to bear knowledge from different disciplines, one organization might be able to do it. And it also requires perspectives that get at probabilities of things occurring. You know, having a probabilistic understanding of outcomes is very important to understanding resilience and what outcomes can be if certain thresholds for bad outcomes or good outcomes are passed. and an ability to think in terms of dynamics and how systems change and evolve over time. So I guess I would say it's not so much could it be done within an organization or could it be done collaboratively by multiple organizations. It's more, do you have the right mix of skills and knowledge available among the people who are collaborating to undertake it? I do think it's hard to bring the framework to bear through a single person.
This is Doug. If I could weigh in as well, I share all of what Scott said. I think the reality, and we've talked a lot about this, and we grapple with it somewhat in the report, is the reality is there'll probably be very different kinds of uses of this framework that range on a spectrum at one extreme of being really full-fledged, thoroughgoing, research-based scientific exercises that might be quite expensive and require a significant amount of time to do a full-blown comprehensive assessment of all of the effects surrounding certain kinds of aspects of the food system. On the other end, I think there are people who are already looking at assessments of parts of the food system, and while they may not have the capacity and tools to do a full-blown kind of independent assessment, the framework is still, I think, enormously important, and I don't want this to be lost in the discussion, simply at directing attention to the kinds of questions that they may not yet be asking, in particular, questions that highlight aspects of effects that weren't part of the original motivation, aspects that underscore the trade-offs that are likely to occur, and that at minimum point to whether or not an effect that's outside your original scope might be important enough that you need to go seek out more information and expertise to kind of help grapple with that. I think I'm aware of many, many groups already assessing, if you will, the food system across the United States at many different levels of detail. And it's important, I think, for me to understand that the framework has applications in each of their situations, albeit with different levels of sophistication and different levels of resources.
I received a few requests for us to kind of just restate who from the committee is on this call. We have Malden Nethheim, who is chair of the committee, Ross Hammond, Douglas Jackson-Smith, Scott Swinton, and Susan Krebs-Smith. So our next question comes from Maria Bowman. She asks, in data, metrics, and methods, you note the importance of assumptions and boundaries of chosen methods. Do you believe there is a disincentive for researchers to be too transparent about shortcomings of these?
Oh, Ross,
I think in the long run there shouldn't be a disincentive for researchers to be anything less than transparent about the limitations of any particular approach. And indeed, this framework encourages the idea that all approaches have limitations, and this is a very complex system. And to study it properly may require multiple approaches and complementary ones that have corresponding strengths and weaknesses. And I think transparency in addressing the mix of methods that are as appropriate for any particular question within the food system is absolutely critical.
Scott, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say one of the big things we call for is a circumspect perspective. and that requires a little bit of humility. But it's part of honesty, and so particularly for instances when it's not possible, one doesn't have the resources to look at the entire food system, acknowledging what you're not doing, acknowledging the boundaries of what you are doing, and acknowledging the assumptions that are required for the piece of the system that one is looking at is critically important. And I think we can argue about incentives for behavior, transparent behavior, but I think if you care about honesty, and we're all in this business to give it our best shot at understanding the food system, then you need to be willing to acknowledge what you're not doing, as well as willing to trumpet what it is that you are doing.
Our next question comes from Ellen Gray. She asks, are there any examples in the report that look at farming practices' impact on greenhouse gas emissions?
We haven't looked at this directly as one of our examples, but we certainly discussed this as an issue in the environmental chapter in the report.
And I think the chapter that looks at nitrogen does look at nitrous oxide as a greenhouse gas.
That's true, and ammonia as well.
Next question is from Laura Redner. She asks, for those who are interested in the issue of advocating greater consumption versus the ramifications, the Environmental Working Group has been looking at this issue. For example, there aren't enough fish in the sea to meet the suggested consumption amount. And actually, okay, so there was no question to that one. So Laura, if you have a follow-up question, if you can please type that in. And this is from Laura. Can Scott please expand on the skills and knowledge that might be good to bring to the table?
One of the things I think those of us on this panel enjoyed about participating in this exercise was that we had members of the panel from public health, from occupational safety, sociology, economics, agronomy, plant science, animal science, nutrition. So people who not only do they have different disciplinary knowledge, but they actually have different perspectives on relationships. One of the things that really struck me, so I'm an economist by training, and I tend to look at the world in terms of relationships and functions and incentives and constraints and that kind of thing. And I was really struck by the degree to which people who work in the public health sector think about safe levels and then what happens if you exceed safe levels. But they look at the world much more in terms of thresholds. So I guess I don't have any specific guidelines about, how much variety is the right amount. And certainly the more people you get involved in an exercise, the more transaction costs there are for getting people together and for getting over the translational challenges of the different ways that we each have of expressing the things that we think are important. But I do think that there's strength in diversity, and that when we look at complex dynamic systems like our food system, that kind of diversity of perspective is critically important.
Our next question comes from Michael Jacobson from the Center for Science and Public Interest. He wants to ask more specifically, what's next? Will the committee follow through and use its methodology to analyze the American food system?
Michael, the committee will not do that because we've now completed our task with the development of this report. But we are doing, with the Academy, we're doing quite a lot of work at trying to get this report out so that people can see what we have recommended, can see the kind of methodologies that we're talking about. And we've been talking to some federal agencies in the last couple of days, and there's a great deal of interest in the kind of approaches that we're advocating here in terms of looking broadly at questions of the food system. And so we're very hopeful that this is a first step, that this report and its recommendations will be taken seriously by a number of other agencies that can carry out the next steps.
And this is a little bit of a next step question too, but maybe someone from IOM or NRC can answer. This is from Martin Heller from the University of Michigan. He asked, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee has considered sustainability in their recommendations. The USDA received congressional mandate to avoid this. Does IOM have an outreach or education plan for affecting perspective?
Somebody, would you like to answer that, Ann? This is Ann Yaktine, who is the director of the Food and Nutrition Board.
I would just say that, of course, we're very interested in any follow-on activities that would occur from this report. We don't have any specific plans at the moment for a given activity. We would welcome anyone who's interested in following up with us to develop such an activity, but again, at this point in time, we don't have a specific activity planned.
Our next question is from Kelly Horton. She asks, are there specific recommendations for policymakers in the report? And if yes, can you provide some examples of policy changes we need to further this work?
I think the report actually doesn't make specific recommendations on policy because that was not our charge. We certainly want to encourage policymakers to do the kind of assessments that we've advocated in this report in terms of the decision-making process. But we haven't actually discussed specific policies that we would like to have carried out, other than the continued collection of the appropriate data sets and methodologies and so forth that are part of the report.
I think you can add to that, this is Doug Jackson-Smith, the recommendation that development of expertise, both in terms of human capital and methodologies, ought to be a priority for some of the agencies that support this kind of work.
Thank you, and that was actually the last question we received, so I just want to thank you, everyone, for joining today. Just a reminder that you can get the report and the slides will later be posted at www.iom.edu/food system. And if you have any questions, those are 2 email addresses as well that you can email for more information. Thank you all. Have a great day.